It's easy to get started with web services in Visual Studio because there's pre-made project templates you can use. When creating a service, the first thing you do is create an interface. The interface is the contract and it corresponds to the WSDL document. On that interface, you'll apply various attributes to define what the meaning of each piece is. After you have an interface to define the contract, then you create a class that implements that interface, and this is where the functionality of your service is located. So now let's go build a service. Here we are at Visual Studio and we're going to create a brand new WCF service. Get started, select File, New, Project. Make sure you're in the WCF section. And we're going to create a WCF library. And we'll name this Create Consume Web Service. And when you select OK, then it will create this service that we have right here. Here you can see that we have a service, and the first thing I've done is created an interface. iWeather service. And decorated that iWeather service with an attribute named Service Contract. So now it identifies this interface as a contract for a web service. Now, in the WSDL that gets generated, if you don't define a namespace, it will default to tempuri.org. So what you'll want to do is create your own unique namespace, which is typically the URL of your company. But what it needs to be is a unique string to identify your service. This one looks like a URL, but notice it has a slash on the end, which is a part of the string. If you're ever doing any manual work with namespaces or whatever, don't forget that because it's a common error. Next, I have operations. This is just a method definition. It has an attribute on it called operation contract. I gave this operation contract a name called Get Current Temperature for Place. And I gave that operation a different name, Get Current Temperature for Lat Long. The reason is because WCF does not recognize overloads. You see, if you want to be interoperable across platform, then you have to go after least common denominator behavior, and not every platform, not every language understands overloads. So now we have a contract. The next thing to do is implement that contract. Notice that I implemented the iWeather service. And I have these sophisticated implementations of how to get the temperature. Now we have a service. The next thing for us to do is test the service. If you make sure that the service is selected as the startup project, then you can run the service by clicking Start or F5, and you get this nifty WCF test client tool that's built into Visual Studio. The first thing you'll notice about this tool is this first line right here. If you look at it, this is a URL that's generated by the internal Visual Studio web host. And at the end of this URL, you can see that it has an MEX extension. This is a common way to describe the metadata exchange endpoint. And a metadata exchange is something that allows you to discover and find out what the contents of a service are. In this case, here's a service defined by the iWeather service contract. And iWeather service gives you two different operations. Notice that the names correspond to the name given to the operation when I define the interface. If I pull this back over here and double click, then you can see that I have this nice screen to be able to input data for testing this operation. For example, place, that's a string, so I'll type Denver. Click invoke, and I get a response. 73 was the response from the get temperature for place. Let's test this out. And I'm going to put in this otherworldly latitude longitude for a location somewhere in the galaxy. And type invoke. And I get the response from the get current temperature for lat long. And now I know that my services work. And that's basically how easy it is to create a WCF service with Visual Studio. Once you have a WCF service written, you can write code to consume it. In Visual Studio, you can either create a new project or use an existing project. To use the service, what you do is you create a service reference which generates a proxy. And then you write code that uses the proxy to communicate with the service. Let's go do that. Here we are in Visual Studio, and we're going to create a program that consumes a web service. To get started, select File, New, Project. I'm going to select Visual C#, and this program will be a console application. And I'll name it Weather Service Consumer. And when I hit OK, I'll get a project that looks like this. To use the service, the first thing you need to do is create a service reference. You can do so by right-clicking on Service Reference, and if Service Reference isn't there, you can right-click the project, select Add Service Reference, and then add an address right here. If you know what service you're going to use, either there will be documentation for what that address is, or somebody will give it to you. In this case, the service exists in my project, so I can go over here and click Discover. And there's my service. I can view the internals of this service, what it's capable of, and I have iWeather service right there with two operations. Now to use it in my code, I've got to tell it what namespace I want to use. So I'm going to say Weather Service Ref. And when I hit OK, then I'll get a service reference over here. In this case, I called it Weather Service Proxy because that's really what it is. It's not the service itself. It's an object that performs communication on behalf of my client to the service. So looking inside of this service reference, you can look inside of it too if you go up and select Show All Files. There it is. Inside of here you can see documents like WSDL documents. There's a Weather Service WSDL. What's really interesting here is that we have this reference, Service MAC. And there's a reference, and this is the proxy code that was generated. Here you can see there's a service, an iWeather service contract. Here's a weather service client class, and it derives from client base of iWeather service, and that's part of the WCF infrastructure that allows this proxy to communicate with the service. And then there's the iWeather service. So I just wanted to show that to you because it might be kind of interesting for you to see. But generally, you won't even have to look at any of this code here. Now to build this service, all you have to do is write code that uses this weather service client that you saw in the proxy. So here, I created a new instance of weather service client in the main method. Gave it a name, and declared it as an iWeather service. Now with this iWeather service, I can call methods off of that iWeather service as if I was communicating with an object directly. But remember, you're communicating with a proxy, and the proxy is doing communication for you. So I call that method, I get a response back, and print it out. So let me run this. And there you can see that the current temperature in Denver is 76, and that's the response from the service. And there you have it, a client that consumes a WCF web service. The examples you've seen so far have used primitive types, but you can also use complex types in your services. To create a complex type, create a class. Then add any of the properties that you need to expose as data elements of that class. Once you have a class, then you can decorate it with data contract and data member attributes. Let's go see how. Now you'll learn how to create a complex type. We'll use an existing web service to do it. I'm going to add a class. And I'm going to call this class Weather Forecast. And add it to the project. Let's make it public. And add a couple fields. One will be a date time. And I'll name it date. The next one will be the status, which is a string. Now once I have a class, I have to decorate it with attributes that tell WCF how to handle To indicate that this is complex type WCF, you would add the data contract attribute to it. I'm going to hit Control dot so that I can add the namespace for system runtime serialization. And each of the properties, they would be decorated with the data member. So now I have a class that's a complex type that I can use in my service. So what we'll do is we'll add another operation to this service. And in this case, we want to get a forecast, like say for instance a 5-day forecast. So I'll create a list of weather forecast. And I'll add a namespace for that list. And then I'll call it get forecast. Of course, this has to be decorated as an operation. And I don't need to give this a name because it's unique. I'll save that. Now that we have a contract that defines get forecast and it returns a collection of complex types, we'll need to add that to the service. And here I'll take a shortcut and say implement the interface and add that method here. And add a namespace for the list. And here I want to implement the forecast. And I'll create a new list to work with. And I'm going to populate this list with values for the next 5 days. And for each of the days, I'm going to add a weather forecast. And for each weather forecast, I'm going to set the properties. And I'll set the status to sunny, because that's how it usually is in Denver. Let me move this around to make it just a little bit easier to read. And then I'll simply return that list. And now we have an implementation of that service. And I'll build. And that's successful. Now that we have a new get forecast, let's test it. I'm going to hit F5, and that's going to bring up the WCF test client. Here you can see that I now have get forecast. It doesn't have any input values, so I'll just go ahead and invoke it. Notice how I got that collection of days back. And I got a current date, the next date, and so on. And each day is sunny. So now I know my service works good. Let's consume that service. Right-click and say set a startup project for this existing project over here. I'll move some of these other files out of the way and open this one. Now I'm going to use this weather service, and I'm going to get a list of weather forecast. But what you're going to see is that it doesn't know about weather forecast. So here's how you fix that. Because you see, I added weather forecast after I created this client. So the client doesn't know anything about the weather forecast. To fix that, go over to Service References, select the service you want to use, right-click, and say Update Service Reference. It'll go out, read the WSDL, grab the contract data, and regenerate the proxy. And now, did you see that weather forecast light up? Let's continue. And I'm going to say Weather Service. And I'm going to call Get Forecast. And for each of the items in that forecast, I'm going to print it. Now let me pull that around and format it just a little bit better so we can see the code. And I'll put a nice little banner up here for that. Now when we run this, I have a build error. And in this build error, notice that the error says that I cannot create an array. That's because WCF Web Services defaults to an array for collections in the proxy. So let me show you how to fix that. On the service, you can right-click and say Configure Service Reference. You have various configuration options here. One of them is collection type. See how it defaults to system array? You have various options here. In this case, I would like for the proxy to translate this collection into a list. Because remember, the data that's coming back from the service is in XML format. It's just a sequence of items. So we have to tell the proxy how we want that to be implemented for our local situation. I'll say OK. Now, when I build, then I succeed. And in this case, I'll hit F5, run the program, and you can see that each of the dates printed and the status was sunny. So that's how you add complex types to your services. You also saw how to consume a service that exposes a complex type, how to update your service, and how to configure that service to support different types of collections. In this case, it was a list of weather forecast.